My name is Tom Everett, born in the small farming town of Cedar Grove, deep in the heart of the American Midwest. I was 21 when the war reached our shores, not yet fully a man, yet already carrying the weight of my family's hopes. My father was a stern but fair man, a wheat farmer who rose before dawn and worked until sunset, hands calloused and eyes weathered by endless seasons. My mother tended to the house, keeping it warm and alive with stories and the occasional stubborn laugh that seemed to brighten even the bleakest winter days. I had an older sister, Margaret, who was studying to become a nurse, and a younger brother, Danny, who looked up to me with wide, trusting eyes. Before the war, my days were simple but full. I helped my father in the fields, tinkered with old engines in the barn, and spent evenings reading whatever books I could find in the small town library. Life was predictable, comforting, and safe, a bubble of routine and familiar faces. I dreamed of exploring beyond Cedar Grove, but never imagined the world would reach out to pull me into chaos. The news of Europe's descent into war first reached us through grainy radio broadcasts and newspapers, with headlines that seemed distant and unreal. Yet, as I watched neighbors, friends, and even strangers wrestle with the idea of enlistment, I felt a stirring within me, a mix of duty, curiosity, and an unspoken fear. Little did I know then that stepping forward would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about courage, loss, and survival. Life in Cedar Grove before the war was a quiet rhythm dictated by the cycles of the seasons and the steady hum of daily labor. The town streets were dusty lined with modest homes and family-run shops, and the fields stretched for miles golden under the summer Sunday. Neighbors knew one another by name, and news traveled slowly, often shared over fences or at the local diner. Despite the tranquility, there was an underlying tension in the air, an awareness that the world beyond our small town was unraveling. Across the Atlantic, Europe was engulfed in conflict, and although it felt distant, reports of battles, bombings, and occupation trickled into our homes through radio, broadcasts, and newspapers. Some dismissed it as a European problem, yet the story sparked conversations at every gathering families, debating whether the United States should remain neutral. Neighbors worrying for sons and brothers abroad, and young men like me grappling with the sense that soon our lives might be drawn into the turmoil. My father would often sit at the kitchen table, newspaper in hand, furrowing his brow as he read updates of troop movements and alliances. My mother, meanwhile, fretted quietly over the potential loss of young men from our community, offering prayers and preparing warm meals for a family that might soon be fragmented. Even in school, the teachers spoke of civic duty and patriotism, urging students to contribute to the nation in whatever ways they could. It was a time of contradictions. The comforting familiarity of home and community clashed with the ominous news of war. For me, the distant rumble of global conflict became a personal drumbeat signaling that the safety of Cedar Grove could not last forever. The town's calm, once taken for granted, now felt fragile, as if each sunrise carried both the promise of harvest and the foreboding shadow of a world at war. Little did anyone know how soon that shadow would touch our lives, changing the course of ordinary days into something extraordinary and terrifying. The bonds I had in Cedar Grove were the invisible threads that anchored me to home. My family, though simple, was my world. My father's stern guidance taught me responsibility and resilience, while my mother's gentle encouragement nurtured hope and kindness. Margaret, my older sister, was more than a sibling. She was a confidant, always ready with advice or a listening ear, and her determination to become a nurse inspired me in ways I could not yet articulate. Danny, my younger brother, looked at me with unguarded trust, his eyes reflecting both admiration and the innocence of youth I feared would be shattered by the coming war. Beyond family, there were friends whose laughter and shared adventures filled the long summer days. Jacob, my closest friend since childhood, was a mischievous soul with a daring streak, the kind of companion who could turn even mundane chores into unforgettable escapades. The neighbors and townsfolk too formed a network of support-friendly faces who waved from porches, offered advice, or shared the latest news from the wider world. These relationships, seemingly ordinary, became the pillars I would carry in my heart when the war took me far from home, reminding me of who I was and what I was fighting for even in the darkest moments to come. As the days grew heavier with news from overseas, a knot of unease tightened in my chest. The distant war that once seemed like a story in a newspaper was slowly creeping into our lives, and I could feel its pull. I knew, as did my friends and neighbors, that the safety and simplicity of Cedar Grove were fragile, precarious at best. Each headline, each broadcast of battles and losses whispered a reminder that nothing would remain untouched. When the draft notice arrived, my world shifted in an instant. Fear mingled with a strange sense of duty. I felt compelled to step forward, yet terrified of the unknown. Thoughts of my family haunted me, my father's proud but worried gaze, my mother's quiet prayers, Margaret's concerned eyes, and Danny's trusting smile. Leaving them was unbearable, yet I could not ignore the stirring in my heart that urged me toward service. In the evenings, I would walk the familiar paths of our fields, feeling the wind on my face and imagining the distant shores where battles raged. I wrestled with conflicting emotions, the excitement of adventure, the dread of danger, and the weight of responsibility. Would I return unchanged? Could I survive what lay ahead? The questions were unanswerable, yet they clung to me, shaping every thought. Even as I packed my few belongings, said my farewells, and tried to memorize the comfort of home, a quiet voice within warned me that life as I knew it was about to end. The journey ahead promised trials that would test my courage, reshape my beliefs, and confront me with the fragility of human existence. And in that uncertainty, I found the first flickers of resolve and unspoken determination to face whatever awaited, carrying the spirit of Cedar Grove in my heart. The morning sun spilled across the fields of Cedar Grove, casting long shadows over golden wheat that swayed gently in the breeze. The air was rich with the scent of earth and grass, punctuated by the distant crow of roosters and the soft laughter of children playing near the farmhouse. Smoke from chimneys curled lazily into the sky, and the rhythmic clatter of tools in the barn reminded me of the life I was about to leave behind. Every detail, the worn wooden fences, the dusty dirt roads, the familiar faces nodding in, greeting etched itself into my memory, a fragile snapshot of peace. I knew that soon these simple comforts would fade into the past, replaced by the roar of guns, the weight of uniforms, and the unforgiving unknown. Yet in that fleeting tranquility, I felt a quiet strength stirring within me, a tether to home that would guide me through whatever lay ahead. Arriving at the training camp was like stepping into an entirely new world. The air was thick with the scent of canvas, tents, gun oil, and sweat mingling with the morning fog that rolled over the barracks. I remember the sharp bark of the drill sergeant's voice cutting through the quiet dawn, demanding attention and obedience. Every movement from standing at attention to saluting was scrutinized, and mistakes were met with reprimands that stung not just physically, but deep in the pride I carried from home. The days were long, starting before sunrise and stretching past sunset. Physical training pushed us to our limits, running across muddy fields, dragging weighted packs, crawling under barbed wire, and climbing obstacle courses that seemed impossible at first glance. My muscles ached in ways I had never known, and my lungs burned with each forced march. Yet there was a strange rhythm to it, a method that gradually transformed exhaustion into resilience. I felt my body adapting, my mind sharpening, and the unspoken bond among us, recruits slowly forming. Mark, a wiry kid from Ohio, quickly became my closest companion. His humor was a shield against the relentless pressure, a way to survive the drills without losing our minds. Together we navigated the routines, traded tips on shooting accuracy, and supported one another when the sergeant's shouts threatened to break our morale. Even in moments of frustration, I felt a sense of camaraderie that I had never experienced back in Cedar Grove, a shared determination to endure, to become soldiers, to be ready for whatever awaited. The training also taught lessons beyond physical endurance. Discipline, attention to detail, and the understanding that every action could have consequences in life or death scenarios were drilled into us with relentless repetition. I learned to read the expressions of my instructors, to anticipate commands, and to rely on instincts honed under pressure. By the end of the first few weeks, the fear and uncertainty that had gripped me upon arrival began to give way to confidence, a fragile, tentative sense that I might survive and even excel in the chaos that awaited beyond the camp's fences. Even as I grew stronger, the thought of leaving this controlled environment for the unpredictability of the front lines weighed heavily on me. The training had prepared us in body and mind, yet none of us could fully grasp what awaited us in the storm of war. And still, with each dawn, each drill, each push beyond what I thought possible, I felt a flicker of readiness, a tiny ember of courage burning against the unknown. The day I left Cedar Grove for the front lines was a blur of emotions I could hardly name. The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the familiar dirt roads and golden fields I had walked countless times. My mother's hands trembled as she adjusted my uniform, smoothing the creases with a tenderness that belied the worry in her eyes. My father stood silently, arms crossed, jaw tight, yet the pride he carried for me shone through every measured movement. Margaret hugged me so tightly, I thought I might be crushed, whispering instructions to write often and reminders to eat properly. And Danny, my little brother, clung to my leg, eyes wide and uncomprehending, as if he feared I might vanish before his very gaze. We walked together to the train station, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder heavy with both gear and unspoken emotion. The platform was crowded with young men like me, faces pale with fear, eyes bright with resolve, families clinging to them, exchanging hurried embraces and whispered prayers. The whistle of the engine cut sharply through the morning air, signaling departure. My father patted my shoulder, finally breaking his stoic demeanor. "Make us proud, Tom," he said quietly. As the train lurched forward, I pressed my face to the window, drinking in every detail: the white picket fences, the tall corn stalks, the small wooden church with its weathered steeple. Each familiar sight felt impossibly precious, as if I might never see them again. Letters and gifts were exchanged between families and departing soldiers, scraps of connection meant to bridge the distance and the uncertainty. Inside my compartment, I clutched the small notebook my mother had pressed into my hands, a collection of her prayers, Margaret's sketches, and Danny's childish scribbles. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. This journey was not just mine. It carried the hopes and fears of those I loved. And as the train disappeared into the horizon, a mixture of fear, longing, and determination filled me. I knew that once I crossed that threshold, nothing would remain the same. Not the world, not my family, and certainly not myself. The train rattled relentlessly across the countryside, each turn of the wheels carrying us further from the safety of Cedar Grove and deeper into uncertainty. Inside the compartment, the air was thick with the mingled scents of leather sweat and damp wool, punctuated by nervous laughter and whispered conversations among young men who, like me, were untested and wide-eyed. Some tried to make light of the journey, cracking jokes and trading stories, but beneath the surface, tension clung to every shoulder and furrowed brow. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the landscape in dusky shades of gray and amber, I watched unfamiliar towns slip by their streets empty and silent, and felt a strange mixture of awe and apprehension. For the first time, I realized how vast the world truly was and how small, fragile, and unprepared I felt in comparison. Outside, the wind whipped across the open fields, carrying a chill that seeped through my uniform and sent shivers down my spine, a physical reminder that comfort and warmth were now fleeting luxuries. We shared rations and stories, forming tentative bonds over the hum of the rails. Jacob, the wiry Ohio kid who had become my closest companion in training, leaned over and whispered a reassurance. "We'll get through this together, Tom." His words, simple as they were, offered a fragile thread of courage I clung to. The reality of the war ahead pressed upon us with every mile, reports of battles, the sight of soldiers returning with blank-haunted expressions, and the hushed conversations about what awaited on the front lines. Night fell and the train plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the dim glow of lanterns and the occasional flicker of moonlight through the windows. As I lay back against the warm bench, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts drifted to home, to my family, and to the life I had left behind. I tried to imagine what awaited us, the chaos, the fear, and perhaps moments of courage I had yet to discover. In that quiet uncertainty, I felt the first true weight of war settle upon my shoulders, a burden I could not yet see the end of, but one I would carry nonetheless. Our first assignment came sooner than I expected. We were deployed to a small contested sector near the outskirts of a French village, tasked with securing a supply route critical for advancing forces. The morning air was thick with fog, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and smoke from distant fires. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the soft murmur of the river, the sudden cry of a bird, seemed amplified, warning of unseen dangers. My heart pounded as I tightened the straps of my pack and adjusted the rifle in my hands, acutely aware that training drills were nothing compared to the reality unfolding before me. The village itself was eerily quiet: buildings scarred by previous skirmishes, windows, shattered doors hanging on their hinges. We moved cautiously through the streets, boots crunching over broken stones, trying to maintain formation while scanning for ambushes. The tension was unbearable. Every shadow could conceal an enemy, every rustle a threat. Jacob stuck close, whispering reminders and offering a reassuring nod each time our eyes met. Despite my fear, I felt a strange surge of focus, a hyper-awareness that made every movement deliberate, every decision critical. We encountered our first firefight near a collapsed barn. Bullets ricocheted from walls and the air was pierced with shouts in multiple languages. The smell of gunpowder stung my nostrils, and the acrid smoke made my eyes water. One of our men went down. He had been struck while trying to aid a wounded comrade. The chaos was overwhelming, yet I found myself moving instinctively, following commands, returning fire when needed, helping carry the injured to safety. The camaraderie forged in training crystallized in those moments. Without Jacob's steady presence and the unspoken support of our squad, I'm not sure I would have found the courage to keep moving forward. Hours passed in what felt like minutes. When the firefight finally subsided, the village was silent again, save for groans of the wounded and the distant rumble of artillery. My hands shook and sweat stung my eyes, but there was a strange sense of accomplishment. I had survived my first real battle, and more importantly, I had seen the fragile humanity within the Chaos Men, helping men courage, emerging amid fear and the raw weight of responsibility, pressing down on each of us. By the time night fell, we had secured the route and set up temporary defenses. Exhausted, I sank against the remnants of a stone wall staring at the starless sky. The mission had been successful, yet the cost was painfully evident. Fear, adrenaline, and a deep awareness of mortality settled over me, mingling with a quiet determination. If this was what war demanded, I would have to adapt, endure, and find the strength to survive whatever lay ahead. My first battle was over, but the war both outside and within me had only just begun. The days following our first engagement were a blur of exhaustion, vigilance, and uneasy adaptation. Every morning brought the same routine: check weapons, patrol, assign sectors, repair barricades, and remain alert to any sign of enemy activity. The simple acts I had once taken for granted, sleeping through the night, eating without worry, even standing without tension, became distant memories. My muscles ached constantly, my hands were raw from gripping the rifle for hours on end, and my mind replayed the chaos of that first firefight with relentless clarity. Losses weighed heavily on the squad. Faces that had laughed with me during training now lay motionless in the mud or limply slumped against crumbling walls. Each casualty drilled into me a lesson I hadn't anticipated. Survival depended not only on skill and courage, but also on composure, quick thinking, and trust in those beside me. Jacob and I developed silent signals, subtle ways to communicate in the midst of noise and confusion, conserving breath and keeping focus. Without that unspoken understanding, we would have faltered more than once. Adapting to the rhythm of war was another challenge. Supplies were often scarce, sleep was fleeting, and hunger gnawed constantly. I learned to conserve energy, to prioritize tasks, and to improvise when the situation demanded it. The once predictable days of Cedar Grove had taught me patience and diligence, but here flexibility and intuition became essential. I watched seasoned soldiers move with practiced ease, absorbing their strategies and adopting small habits that enhanced my own chances of survival. The mental strain was as taxing as the physical. Each patrol, each reconnaissance tested my focus and resolve. At night, I often found myself replaying encounters, questioning decisions, and imagining alternative outcomes that might have spared a life or prevented a mistake. Yet slowly, I began to recognize a rhythm in the chaos, a pattern to the unpredictability. Fear remained, but it became manageable, a companion rather than a master. I could anticipate dangers, respond to threats more efficiently, and conserve energy for when it truly mattered. By the end of those early weeks, I realized that adaptation was not merely about survival, it was about transformation. The boy who had left Cedar Grove carried a mixture of trepidation and hope, but now hardened by fatigue, tested by danger, and strengthened by camaraderie, I felt the first genuine sense of readiness. I was beginning to understand what it meant to be a soldier, not just in body, but in mind and spirit. The war had claimed innocence, but it was also shaping resilience. As the weeks passed, each mission, each patrol brought new challenges that tested the limits of endurance and courage. I could feel a change within me, fear no longer paralyzed, but sharpened, transforming into vigilance and calculated resolve. Yet beneath that growing confidence, a sense of foreboding lingered. Rumors of large-scale offensives, fierce battles, and mounting casualties circulated among the ranks, seeping into our conversations and dreams alike. I found myself staring at the horizon during quiet moments, imagining the chaos that awaited us, the dangers that training could never fully prepare one for. Deep down, I knew that the trials of this war were only beginning. The first brush with combat had awakened something primal, and soon the storm of battle would surge in full force, pushing every man to the edge of fear, endurance, and morality. The stage was set for the true test of body, mind, and spirit. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the fields as we approached the outskirts of the village, obscuring what lay ahead. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, my boots sinking into the soft, damp earth, my rifle clutched tightly in hand. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional whistle of the wind through shattered buildings. I had trained for this moment, yet nothing in drills or simulations had prepared me for the raw reality of advancing into a village that had already tasted war. As we crested the ridge, the first shots rang out. The crack of rifles and the boom of mortars shattered the eerie calm, forcing me to my knees instinctively. Smoke and dust hung in the air, turning the familiar landscape into a surreal haze where every shadow could conceal death. I felt my heart hammering against my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins, sharpening my senses to an almost painful clarity. Every movement of my squad was synchronized, each man relying on the other to survive. Jacob was beside me, his face pale but determined eyes, scanning the chaos for threats and signals. We entered the village streets cautiously, stepping over debris and shattered wood. Houses stood like hollowed shells, windows blown out walls, scarred by shrapnel. Then suddenly a burst of machine gun fire erupted from a side alley. One of our men went down instantly, a lifeless weight against the cobblestone. My stomach twisted and for a moment terror froze me. But training took over. I returned fire aimed with precision, moving as part of a unit rather than as a terrified individual. We dragged the wounded into cover, applying bandages hastily while shouting orders over the din of combat. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. The village was a battlefield, every corner a potential ambush, every street a gauntlet. I lost count of how many men were injured or killed, but the loss was etched into me with painful clarity. The sounds, the screams, the cracking of rifles, the thundering artillery became a backdrop to every decision I made, each one balancing life, death, and duty. Amid the chaos, a strange camaraderie formed. We were no longer merely soldiers, but a tightly bound unit, each man carrying the other through the nightmare. When the fighting subsided, the village lay in a grim silence, smoke curling from smoldering ruins. I sank against a shattered wall chest, heaving hands, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. The mission had been a success, yet the cost was painfully apparent. Faces of fallen comrades, some familiar, some newly met, haunted my mind. I realized then that this war would not just test my body, it would challenge my spirit, my morality, and my understanding of courage. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what it meant to be a soldier. Fear had not vanished. It had sharpened, becoming both a warning and a motivator. Survival demanded everything: focus, bravery, and the unyielding support of those beside me. This was only the beginning, and I sensed deep in my bones that the true trials of war were still to come. The aftermath of the first battle left a heaviness in the air that no amount of training could have prepared me for. The village, once a quiet cluster of homes and streets, now lay in smoldering ruin. Smoke curled from collapsed roofs, and the acrid scent of gunpowder and charred wood filled my lungs. The groans of the wounded echoed through the broken alleyways, mingling with the silent stillness of those who had fallen. Each face I recognized or had come to know in those few days etched itself into my memory with painful clarity. Jacob was beside me, tending to a soldier who had taken a bullet through the shoulder. His hands were steady, his voice calm, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the same strain I felt pressing on my own chest. Fear and guilt intertwined, gnawing at me with relentless intensity. I kept replaying the moments of the firefight, questioning every decision I had made. Had I acted too slowly? Could I have saved more? The faces of men who had died under my watch haunted my thoughts, and a heavy weight settled over my soul, a mixture of sorrow, guilt, and the unshakable knowledge that war spares no one. The psychological toll was immediate and brutal. I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, a twig snapping, a distant shout, the flutter of a flag in the breeze. Sleep became elusive. My dreams were invaded by flashes of smoke screams and the twisted forms of those we could not save. Even in moments of calm, my hands trembled when gripping my rifle, and a cold sweat clung to my skin whenever artillery roared in the distance. I realized that survival demanded more than physical endurance it required, a constant negotiation with fear, a discipline of the mind I had not anticipated. Amid this turmoil, moments of humanity pierced through the horror. I watched soldiers kneeling to comfort the wounded, sharing water and rations, whispering words of encouragement to the terrified. These small acts of compassion stood in stark contrast to the carnage around us, reminding me that even in the chaos of death, the bonds of brotherhood and shared experience endured. It was a fragile lifeline for my psyche, a reminder that amidst loss and despair, resilience could emerge. By nightfall, the village had been secured, yet I could not shake the weight of what I had witnessed. The battle had stripped away any illusions I had carried about war being distant or abstract. Fear, grief, and exhaustion were constant companions now shaping my thoughts and forcing me to confront the stark reality. The war was relentless, impartial, and unforgiving. And within that harsh truth, I understood that survival demanded not only courage in action, but also the strength to endure the haunting memories, the moral burdens, and the relentless pressure of life and death decisions that lay ahead. I had grown accustomed, or so I thought, to the chaos of the battlefield, when a sudden volley of artillery shattered that fragile sense of control. One instant, I was moving cautiously along a shattered wall, scanning for enemy positions, and the next, a sharp pain tore through my leg. I stumbled, collapsing onto the cold, muddy ground, a burning shock radiating with every heartbeat. The world seemed to blur around me, the cries of the wounded, the staccato of rifle fire, and the acrid smoke that burned my eyes. Jacob was at my side, instantly shouting my name as he assessed the injury. Blood soaked my trousers and panic surged through me. I had never felt vulnerability so intensely. For the first time, I realized how fragile a body really was under fire. Every instinct screamed to crawl to safety, yet movement caused searing pain. I clutched my leg, trying to stop it from trembling, and in that moment, the battlefield felt both impossibly vast and suffocatingly close. Before aid could reach us, enemy soldiers advanced from a nearby alley, cutting off our retreat. The realization hit me we were surrounded. My wound slowed me, and surrender or capture was no longer theoretical. Hands raised under the watchful eyes of soldiers armed and unyielding, I felt a profound mix of fear and helplessness. The weight of being at the mercy of others pressed down on me heavy and unrelenting. Yet, even in that vulnerability, I sensed the importance of composure. Every twitch, every word could alter the outcome, and survival now depended on mental control as much as physical endurance. The captors moved us swiftly, herding the wounded into a temporary holding area. The space was cramped, dimly lit, filled with the groans of injured soldiers and the occasional shouted order. Pain, fear, and humiliation mingled. I struggled to maintain focus, reminding myself that panic would not save me. Instead, I observed, listened, and planned small ways to endure, to conserve energy, protect my mind, and support those near me as best I could. Jacob thankfully had avoided capture, and I drew courage from the hope that he might find a way to aid me, or that the war might yet offer an opportunity for escape or rescue. In the quiet moments between patrols and interrogations, I reflected on the fragility of life and the arbitrary nature of fate. A single misstep, a moment too slow or too fast, had brought me from relative safety to helplessness. Yet within that vulnerability, I found an unexpected clarity, the importance of mental resilience, the need to regulate fear, and the awareness that survival often required patience, cunning, and the strength to endure what the body and mind were never meant to face. The experience left scars beyond the wound itself, deep marks on my psyche, shaping the soldier, and man I was becoming in ways I could not yet fully comprehend. The war had already stripped away my illusions, but nothing could have prepared me for the moral quagmires that would test not my strength but my conscience. During a night patrol through the ruins of a bombed-out village, we discovered a small group of civilians hiding in a collapsed cellar. They were terrified, women and children clutching each other, eyes wide with confusion and despair. A scout reported that enemy combatants might be using the same building as a hiding place, and our orders were clear: eliminate any threat to secure the area. I froze, my rifle heavy in my hands as the weight of the decision pressed down. Following orders would mean risking the lives of innocents, but hesitating could endanger my squad and compromise the mission. My training demanded obedience, yet my humanity screamed otherwise. The voices of my family of Cedar Grove echoed in my mind, reminding me of the life I had fought to protect, not just my own, but the innocence of those who had no part in this conflict. Jacob nudged me subtly, sensing my hesitation, and whispered, "Do what you think is right, Tom. Don't let fear or orders strip you of yourself." His words became an anchor as I carefully maneuvered us to minimize danger to the civilians. We cleared the surrounding streets, drawing fire when necessary while signaling the villagers to escape into safer areas. Each decision was tense, calculated, and terrifying. One wrong move could result in death for us or for them. In the aftermath, as the village settled into an uneasy quiet, I realized that war was never just about strategy or survival. It was about choosing which principles to uphold when all paths led to risk and suffering. I felt the gnawing ache of moral compromise. Did my choices truly save lives or merely delay tragedy? The ethical burdens weighed heavily, a constant companion that no amount of courage or skill could lighten. That night, as I lay in a shallow trench under a fractured sky, I reflected on the duality of man in war, capable of courage and compassion, yet forced to confront destruction and death. My internal conflicts churned, shaping a consciousness I could no longer ignore. I had survived the battlefield, but the moral trials deciding who lives, who dies, and what price to pay for conscience were the battles that would linger far longer, haunting my thoughts long after the echoes of gunfire faded. The war was testing not only my endurance, but the essence of who I was. And in this crucible of fear, duty, and moral ambiguity, I began to understand that the true measure of a soldier was not in surviving combat alone, but in surviving the choices the war demanded of one's soul. The battlefield was a landscape transformed into a surreal and hostile world, one that seemed almost alive in its cruelty. Craters pockmarked the earth, remnants of artillery shells that had torn through the once fertile fields. Mud and debris clung to my boots as I moved cautiously, each step a reminder of how treacherous the ground had become. Broken fences jutted out like skeletal fingers, and the skeletal remains of trees stripped of leaves and bark swayed eerily in the cold wind, groaning under the weight of damage and age. The buildings we passed were hollowed shells, their facades pockmarked with bullet holes, windows blown out, and roofs collapsed under the impact of explosives. The smell of smoke, burning wood, and cordite hung heavily in the air, mixing with the acrid tang of blood and the damp, earthy scent of mud. Every corner, every alley seemed to hold a threat, and even the smallest movement, a fluttering piece of cloth or a falling shutter, could trigger an instinctive reaction. Sounds were magnified here in ways that unsettled the mind. The crack of rifles, the distant thump of mortars, and the occasional scream formed a discordant symphony, yet beneath it all was the subtle whisper of wind through shattered streets, the drip of water from broken gutters, and the faint shuffle of fellow soldiers' boots. I learned to filter the chaos, distinguishing danger from background noise, trusting instincts honed by fear and necessity. The weather added its own cruelty. Rain turned trenches and pathways into slippery traps, each step threatening to topple me into mud and ruin. Fog clung stubbornly to low-lying areas, hiding both ally and enemy alike, creating an ever-shifting landscape of uncertainty. Nights were the most treacherous. The darkness swallowed familiar landmarks, leaving only the dim glow of flares or distant artillery to guide movements. Amid this destruction, nature persisted stubbornly. A few stubborn weeds pushed through the rubble, and birds occasionally stirred their distant calls, sounding almost alien against the backdrop of ruin. These small reminders of life were surreal, fleeting glimpses of normalcy amidst chaos, yet they also underscored how far the world had fallen from what I once knew. In this environment, every decision, every movement became entwined with survival. The battlefield was not merely a stage for combat, it was a living, breathing force, shaping our actions, testing our resolve, and imprinting itself on memory with unrelenting intensity. The landscape itself demanded attention, respect, and fear, and to navigate it was to understand that war was as much about the environment as it was about the enemy. After weeks immersed in the chaos of battle, I began to feel a shift within myself, a subtle yet profound change in the way I perceived war. At first, I had viewed it as a test of courage, a duty to be fulfilled with discipline and skill. Training had instilled in me a sense of order, and the belief that following orders and executing maneuvers efficiently was the essence of soldiering. But the reality on the front lines was far more complex, far more harrowing than any drill or simulation could convey. The faces of the fallen haunted my thoughts, their expressions frozen in moments of fear, pain, or confusion. Each loss was a brutal reminder of the fragility of life and the randomness of survival. I began to question not only the purpose of specific battles, but the broader justification of the conflict itself. Strategy, victory, and mission objectives seemed abstract against the human cost, and I felt the weight of every decision I made. Every shot fired, every command followed every choice to prioritize one life over another. Amid this turmoil, small moments of clarity emerged. A glance shared with a terrified civilian spared from harm, a comrade quietly tending to the wounded, or a simple act of courage by a fellow soldier reminded me that humanity could endure even in the darkest circumstances. These moments were fragile, fleeting, yet they anchored me, offering glimpses of hope and reason amidst chaos. I realized that fear was no longer my master. It had become a tool shaping my instincts and sharpening my awareness. Courage, I learned, was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And yet, with each decision and each brush with mortality, I felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier. War was no longer a distant concept. It had transformed into a series of intimate moral confrontations, each shaping the man I was becoming. By the time I paused to catch my breath in a quiet, shattered alley, I understood that survival was about more than physical endurance. It demanded moral resilience, an ability to process grief, to reconcile with fear, and to hold on to compassion even when destruction surrounded you. The boy who had left Cedar Grove with notions of duty and honor had been tempered by fire, shaped by experience, and marked by the understanding that the cost of war is measured not only in bodies but in the soul. This awareness became both a burden and a guide, a lens through which I would interpret every action, every choice, and every fleeting moment of humanity as the war continued to unfold. The weeks following the fiercest battles brought a different kind of exhaustion, one that no amount of sleep or food could fully relieve. My body ached constantly, every muscle protesting after relentless marches and long hours in trenches. Yet, the physical strain was only part of the burden. My mind refused to rest. Images of fallen comrades and the faces of terrified civilians replayed unbidden, haunting my thoughts during quiet moments and in dreams alike. Sleep became a fragile, fleeting refuge. Even when I managed to lie down, my heart raced with phantom gunfire, and the smell of smoke and gunpowder seemed to cling to my senses. Each night I awoke drenched in sweat, recalling flashes of violence I had witnessed, struggling to separate memory from nightmare. It was as if the battlefield had seeped into my very being, refusing to release its grip even in the brief intervals of peace. The psychological weight extended beyond fear. Guilt gnawed at me relentlessly, the survivor's burden, watching men I had come to call friends fall beside me, unable to intervene in time. Jacob's face haunted me, a reminder that even the strongest bonds could not shield one from loss. And yet, amidst this despair, there were moments of fragile camaraderie. Shared glances with comrades, whispered jokes to mask anxiety, or the simple act of helping a wounded soldier provided a brief reprieve, a reminder that we were not alone in our struggle. Even simple decisions became laden with mental strain. Where to move, when to rest, how to respond to orders, all were intensified by the ever-present specter of mortality. I realized that the battle was not only fought against an external enemy, but also within my own mind. Fatigue and trauma intertwined, shaping every thought, every reaction, every heartbeat. By the end of each day, I understood that survival depended as much on endurance of the mind as on physical strength. The war had become an unrelenting test of resilience, forcing me to confront fear, sorrow, and guilt simultaneously. I could feel myself changing, hardening in some ways, yet increasingly aware of the fragile humanity that remained at the core of every decision, every action, and every fleeting moment of hope. The physical toll of the battles had begun to manifest in ways that were impossible to ignore. My legs, still tender from a shrapnel wound sustained weeks earlier, throbbed constantly, each step a reminder of the vulnerability I could no longer deny. Simple movements, climbing over debris, crouching in trenches, even lifting my rifle sent waves of pain through my body, yet retreat was never an option. The wound had partially healed, but stiffness and lingering soreness made every day a struggle, a negotiation between willpower and the limitations of flesh. Other injuries, both my own and those of comrades, highlighted the fragility of human endurance. Blisters, bruises, and strains from long marches, heavy packs, and the relentless weight of gear compounded existing wounds. Nights were spent on hard, cold ground, the chill seeping through thin blankets, muscles stiff with fatigue. Every sound, the drip of water through damaged roofs, the distant rumble of artillery, the shuffle of soldiers moving cautiously, reminded me that the body could fail at any moment and weakness could cost lives. Nutrition and sleep were in short supply. Meals were often meager, cold, and insufficient, leaving my stomach empty even as exhaustion consumed me. Sleep came in short, restless intervals, often interrupted by nightmares of fallen friends or the echoing crack of distant gunfire. Over time, these deficits eroded not only my strength, but also my patience, focus, and morale, forcing me to rely on sheer determination to continue functioning. Despite the pain and physical limitations, survival demanded adaptation. I learned to pace myself to conserve energy and to rely on my squad for support during the most demanding tasks. Jacob and others helped me carry gear, guided me through difficult terrain, and reminded me that endurance was as much about strategy as it was about strength. These small acts of solidarity became lifelines, anchoring me in the midst of physical suffering. The battlefield had left indelible marks on my body, each scar a testament to what I had endured. But I understood that the injuries were only one part of the war's toll. The body could heal eventually, yet the mind and spirit would carry the weight of these trials far longer, shaping the soldier I was becoming with each passing day. One evening, after a long day securing a supply line near a contested village, our squad received orders that would test more than just our physical endurance. Intelligence had identified a small group of enemy combatants using a civilian building as a temporary stronghold. Our instructions were clear: neutralize the threat to secure the area. Yet upon arriving at the location, I realized that the building was teeming not only with armed opponents, but also with frightened civilians who had no part in the conflict. My mind raced. Following orders meant acting decisively and potentially endangering innocent lives. Hesitation could compromise our mission and put my squad at risk. I felt the weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders, heavier than any pack, any rifle, or any wound I had carried. Jacob caught my eye and whispered, "We do what we must, but don't lose yourself." His words anchored me, reminding me that strategy and morality could not be entirely separated, even in war. We devised a plan to minimize civilian casualties while fulfilling the objective. Half of our team would create a diversion to draw enemy attention, while the rest guided the civilians to safety through a concealed route we had identified earlier. Every step required calculation. One false move could result in death for us or the people we aimed to protect. My heart pounded as we executed the plan, sweat stinging my eyes, muscles burning from exertion, adrenaline sharpening every decision. The operation was a partial success. Most of the civilians escaped unharmed, and we neutralized the enemy combatants without catastrophic loss. But the experience left a mark. I felt a strange mixture of relief, guilt, and sober reflection. Relief that lives had been spared, guilt that some danger remained, and reflection on the moral compromises that war demanded. This incident forced me to confront the harsh reality that survival often required choices between conflicting imperatives, duty strategy, ethics, and human compassion. That night, as I tended to minor injuries and reviewed the events with Jacob, I understood that war was as much a test of judgment as of bravery. The lessons were bitter yet essential. Sometimes one must sacrifice immediate desires or comfort to achieve greater objectives, and sometimes survival requires negotiating the fine line between moral duty and strategic necessity. I had faced a crucible of conscience, and it had left me changed, more aware of the complexities of command responsibility and the human cost embedded in every decision. After the intense engagement in the village and the moral weight of the decisions we had faced, our unit was reassigned to a different sector. This time, a mission less about direct combat and more about securing supply routes, aiding displaced civilians, and supporting rebuilding efforts in recently liberated areas. The shift felt disorienting at first. The adrenaline-fueled urgency of firefights was replaced by an environment where vigilance and strategy mattered in subtler ways. Yet, I quickly realized that these new responsibilities were no less critical nor less demanding. Our first task involved scouting damaged roads, clearing debris, and ensuring that essential supplies reached both soldiers and civilians. Every assignment demanded meticulous attention, careful coordination, and a constant awareness of potential threats. Ambushes could come from hidden snipers or unexpected pockets of resistance, and every decision when to move, which route to take, how to protect civilians carried tangible consequences. The physical challenges remained, but the emphasis on tactical judgment and adaptability introduced a new layer of complexity to my understanding of warfare. I also found myself taking on small leadership responsibilities. Less experienced soldiers looked to me for guidance, and I felt the responsibility to balance authority with empathy. Jacob and I worked closely to mentor younger recruits, teaching them the lessons we had painfully learned on the front lines, while also encouraging them to maintain their humanity despite the horror surrounding us. In doing so, I began to appreciate that combat was not the only measure of a soldier's worth. Adaptability, judgment, and moral courage were equally vital. This period of transition brought a profound change in my perception of the war. I saw that victory and survival were not solely achieved through firepower, but through strategy, cooperation, and care for the people caught in the conflict. Every decision was a microcosm of the broader stakes: the safety of civilians, the effectiveness of our operations, and the preservation of our own integrity. Slowly, I began to feel a sense of agency, a confidence in my ability to navigate complex situations without losing sight of the values that had guided me from Cedar Grove. By the end of the first week in this new assignment, I understood that the war demanded constant evolution physically, mentally, and morally. I had moved beyond mere survival. I was learning to lead, to make strategic compromises, and to act decisively in situations where both action and restraint carried profound consequences. These lessons, hard earned in the crucible of conflict, would shape the remainder of my journey, preparing me for the final trials and the eventual reckoning with what it truly meant to endure and emerge changed. As the front lines quieted and the immediate dangers of battle receded, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the consequences of the war, not only on those around me, but on the very nature of life and human responsibility. The sights and sounds of destruction, the faces of the wounded, and the lives lost pressed heavily upon my consciousness, forcing me to confront the broader meaning of the violence I had witnessed. I began to understand that war was more than strategy and survival. It was a stark testament to what humanity could endure and, at times, inflict upon itself. In these moments of introspection, the value of peace became painfully clear. I thought of my family back in Cedar Grove, the calm fields and quiet routines I had once taken for granted. The contrast between home and the battlefield highlighted how fragile stability truly was and how precious even the smallest gestures of normalcy and compassion could be. I realized that every choice I had made, whether to spare a civilian, protect a comrade, or act with restraint amidst chaos, was a thread in a larger tapestry of moral responsibility. The war had stripped life to its essentials, revealing both the darkness and resilience within the human spirit. I also reflected on the personal duty that came with survival. Each man who endured the horrors of battle carried not just memories, but a responsibility to honor the fallen, to bear witness to the suffering, and to preserve the lessons learned for those who might follow. It was clear to me that survival alone was insufficient. One must emerge with a conscience intact, with a commitment to act ethically, even in the most trying circumstances. The war had tested this principle relentlessly, and in navigating those trials, I discovered a profound respect for the moral courage required in both life and combat. By the end of these reflections, I understood that the journey of a soldier extended far beyond the battlefield. Courage, sacrifice, and endurance were inseparable from accountability, empathy, and the pursuit of peace. The war had changed me irrevocably, yet it had also instilled in me a recognition of the profound responsibility every individual carries to protect life, to nurture hope, and to strive for a world where the lessons of conflict could inform the pursuit of harmony. These truths, born from suffering and survival, would guide my choices long after the battles had ended and the echoes of war had faded. Returning to Cedar Grove was like stepping into a world both familiar and strangely altered. The field stretched before me, golden and quiet, yet the rhythm of life felt different, as if the town itself had aged in my absence. Every house, every fence, and every familiar path seemed unchanged, yet I could sense the distance that war had placed between me and the life I had once known. The village had endured, but I was no longer the same person who had left it months or years before. My family greeted me with tears, laughter, and hesitant hugs. My mother's eyes brimmed with relief, my father's stern face softened into a rare, proud smile, and Margaret and Danny clung to me, chattering at once, eager to fill in the gaps that my absence had carved. Their presence was a balm to the soul, yet I could not fully convey the experiences, the fear, or the losses I had witnessed. Words fell short, leaving only gestures, glances, and quiet moments to communicate the magnitude of what I had endured. Walking the familiar streets, I felt a mixture of joy, nostalgia, and unease. The war was over, yet its imprint remained within me, shaping every step, every thought. Returning home was both a victory and a trial. The comfort of family and home contrasted sharply with the scars, memories, and new understanding I carried. I had survived the battlefield, but now I faced the subtler, quieter challenge of reintegration, reconciling who I had become with the life I had once known and finding my place once more in a world that had continued without me. Even after returning to the familiar comforts of home, the war's impact lingered like a shadow I could not shake. My body bore the visible marks of battle scars etched into flesh, a lingering ache in my leg from an old shrapnel wound, and a constant fatigue that sleep alone could not erase. Each step reminded me of the cost, and even the simplest physical tasks carried traces of discomfort and limitation. The mental toll was perhaps even heavier. Nightmares returned with uninvited persistence, replaying battles, the cries of the wounded, and the faces of friends I could not save. I found myself waking in the dark, heart racing, alert to sounds that were no longer threats. Crowds felt oppressive, and conversations sometimes left me detached, as if the world I had returned to moved too slowly, too predictably, to match the intensity of what I had endured. Social reintegration was a challenge in its own right. Friends and neighbors offered smiles and congratulations, yet I struggled to convey the depth of what I had witnessed. Letters to old comrades, brief talks with Jacob, and solitary walks through the fields became my refuge, allowing me to process memories too heavy to share openly. Gradually, I learned to adapt, accepting the limitations of my body, confronting the lingering fears, and finding ways to carry the weight of experience without allowing it to define every moment. Though the scars remained both visible and invisible, I began to understand that endurance extended beyond survival on the battlefield. It required patience, reflection, and the courage to face the self that emerged from war unchanged in name only. In the quiet that followed the end of hostilities, I often found myself reflecting on the meaning of peace and the sacrifices that had made it possible. The faces of fallen comrades, the bravery of those who endured unimaginable fear, and the countless acts of selflessness etched themselves into my memory. Each life lost carried a story, a dream, and a responsibility that now weighed upon those of us who survived. I realized that honoring those sacrifices required more than remembrance. It demanded that we carry forward the lessons learned and strive to protect the fragile gift of peace. I began to understand the true cost of war, not just in lives, but in the psychological and moral burdens borne by each soldier. Courage was not only in facing the enemy, but also in choosing compassion amidst chaos and making decisions that could preserve life even when survival seemed paramount. I thought of the civilians we had, protected the bonds we had forged under fire, and the resilience that had sustained us. These reflections underscored that the responsibility of a soldier extended beyond the battlefield. It encompassed the ethical and human dimensions of our actions. Peace, I realized, was not simply the absence of gunfire. It was an active state nurtured through awareness, empathy, and the willingness to carry forward the stories of the past. It required vigilance, patience, and a recognition that the value of human life is precious and fragile. I vowed that the lessons of sacrifice, morality, and endurance would guide my choices in the years to come. The war had left scars both visible and invisible, but it had also imparted a profound understanding that the pursuit of peace and the acknowledgement of responsibility are as vital as the courage to survive in battle. As I walked through the familiar fields of Cedar Grove, I felt the weight of all I had endured settle around me like a quiet companion. The war had changed everything. My body bore the scars, my mind carried the memories, and my soul had been tempered by the crucible of experience. Yet, amidst the ache and the lingering shadows, there was a subtle, persistent light, the resilience that had allowed me to endure the lessons of courage and compassion and the unshakable ties to those I loved. I paused by the old oak tree near the farm, the one Danny and I had once climbed as children. The wind rustled through its leaves, a gentle reminder that life continues carrying new growth even after devastation. I thought of my fallen comrades, the innocents caught in the crossfire, and the countless moments of humanity that had shone through the darkness. Their stories were etched into my memory, guiding my understanding of sacrifice, responsibility, and the fragile beauty of peace. Returning home was not an end, but a continuation, a journey to reconcile the person I had become with the life I had left behind. The war would always be a part of me, its echoes shaping the choices I would make, the compassion I would extend, and the vigilance I would carry for the world around me. And as I looked toward the horizon, I understood that hope and memory are inseparable. The past informs the present, the losses teach resilience, and the peace we cherish is both earned and fragile. In carrying these truths forward, I knew I could live fully, honor those who could not, and find meaning in the life that remained. The battlefield was behind me, but its lessons would forever resonate in my heart, a silent testament to endurance, humanity, and the pursuit of peace.